Well, I want to thank everyone for coming. This is actually the best turnout I've had in all the places I've gone so far. It's nice to see that this is one place where the myth surrounding Ronald Reagan has not caught on so heavily. This is Portland. I think, you know, a lot of people around the country I've talked to, even people who are progressive, that they have sort of a sense that Ronald Reagan is someone that they didn't really care for, but they don't have a good sense of the degree to which his legacy and his policies have had such a major impact on the country. There's been Gallup polls that have shown that Ronald Reagan is the most popular former president, which is really kind of astounding. More popular than Lincoln or Washington or Kennedy, and I think a big part of the reason is because the media and the publishing industry has done a terrible job at informing people about the implications of Reagan's policies, and that's kind of what I've tried to do in this book, to strip away a little bit of that myth. I'm going to read a couple passages from the book, and after that I'd be glad to take any questions from anyone. This first passage is from the introduction of the book, which lays out a pretty good overview of what the book is about. This book is, well, I guess I should put my glasses on, that would help a little. This book is born of annoyance, a great bewilderment over the myth that continues to surround the presidency of Ronald Reagan. It gives voice to a vast swath of psychically disenfranchised Americans, millions of them, lumped most thickly in the urban areas on either coast, who never understood Reagan's appeal. For more than 2 decades, they have stood by puzzled as this Hollywood actor and shill for General Electric, this obvious enemy of the common people he claimed to represent, this empty suit who believed in flying saucers and allowed an astrologer to guide his presidential scheduling, held sway over the American imagination. Evidence is amassing to support their view. The bitter legacy of Reaganism, the subprime mortgage scandal, the near collapse of the financial system, widening income inequality, the emergence of lockdown America, the obscene inflation of CEO compensation, the end of locally owned media, market crashes, blackouts, drug company scandals, rampant greed and materialism is all around us. As D.H. Lawrence once wrote in another context, the cataclysm has happened. We are among the ruins. But the controversy that once surrounded Reagan seems to have been banished from our public discourse. It is not that there is no public indignation over the state of our democracy. Americans are in wide agreement that the country has gone horribly off course, that Washington is now bought and paid for by corporations and is making little effort to solve the nation's most vexing problems. The great conundrum is this: none of these unmistakable harbingers of American decline is being laid where it belongs, at the door of Ronald Reagan. In the 2 decades that have passed since Reagan left office, no non-academic book has appeared making the case that his policies were destructive for America, even though that view is commonly held among members of the left liberal intelligentsia. We have just finished a presidential campaign season marked by an unseemly competition among Republican aspirants to wrap themselves in the Reagan mantle. Quote, "I am a conservative Republican and I will remain so in the school of Ronald Reagan," proclaimed John McCain. Quote, "I took the same exact path Ronald Reagan took," insisted Mike Huckabee. In a Time magazine cover story headlined, "What Would Ronnie Do?" and Why the Republican Candidates Need to Reclaim the Reagan Legacy, political correspondent Karen Tumulty wrote admiringly that the former president, quote, "embodied the idea that progress comes from going up against the status quo." The disconnect between the Reagan of myth and the Reagan of reality has been palpable in the media for years. Rarely in the history of the democratic world has a press corps been so blind to a leader's faults, so gullible in the face of a concerted effort by a small band of zealots to burnish an otherwise lusterless image. The so-called liberal media failed to utter a peep of protest in 2003 when Esquire magazine named Reagan the greatest living American. This abjuring of all standards of even-handedness by the media could not help but have a profound impact on public opinion. It explains how a 2001 poll by the Gallup organization could find that Americans rate Reagan as the most popular former president, ahead of Kennedy, Lincoln, and Washington. His name adorns public landmarks across the country, the former Washington National Airport, any number of freeways, a medical center in Los Angeles, a Navy aircraft carrier, countless schools and office buildings, and a peak in New Hampshire's famous presidential mountain range. A group called the Ronald Reagan Legacy Project has a goal of pinning his name to a landmark in every one of the nation's 3,067 counties, including a monument to rival the Lincoln Memorial on the Mall in Washington. The apotheosis of Ronald Reagan was never more abject than in the coverage of his funeral. In death, as in the last years of his life, Reagan was revered in the media as a great patriot whose love of country and undying faith in American exceptionalism, the shining city on a hill, were his defining traits. He was lionized for his instinctive identification with the common man and for espousing the traditional values that had once been the backbone of the nation. He was hailed for an infectious optimism that restored the nation's faith in itself and put us on a path to the two longest spurts of economic growth in American history. The scant criticism of his domestic policies, almost none of it found in the electronic media, followed the same well-worn threads. His tax cuts and military buildup led to huge budget deficits. His administration was rife with ethical violations. His cuts in social welfare programs were seen by some as mean-spirited. The script could not have been more adoring if it was written by Nancy Reagan herself, but it was also stunning in its myopia. For Ronald Reagan, when the layers of myth are peeled away, was arguably the least patriotic president in American history. He laid the foundation for a new global economic order in which nationhood would gradually become meaningless. He enacted policies that helped wipe out the high-paying jobs for the working class that were the real backbone of the country. This supposed guardian of traditional values was the architect of wrenching social change that swept across the country in the 1980s, the emergence of an eerie, over-commercialized, postmodern America that has left so much of the populace psychically adrift. Reagan propelled the transition to hyper-capitalism, an epoch in which the forces of self-interest and profit seek to make a final rout of traditional human values. His legacy, mergers, deregulation, tax cuts for the wealthy, privatization, globalization, helped weaken the family and eradicate small-town life and the sense of community. Not only the inner-city poor, but working-class and middle-class Americans in small towns across the country were the losers in the post-Reagan era. Because of deregulation, trucking concerns, bus companies, and airlines have eliminated much of their service to small rural communities, leaving them isolated and economically depressed in a society ever dominated by the great population centers on either coast. Because of corporate consolidation, businesses are no longer owned locally and Main Street is gone. Companies made over many times by mergers and forced to tailor every decision to stock market prices have little loyalty to communities or people. Commerce becomes alien, unreliable, globalized. Plants are closed and companies are downsized, families uprooted, communities left without anchors. Reagan blithely ushered in an age of impermanence. It is remarkable that Reagan took none of the blame for the corporate scandals that marred the last years of the American century and ushered in the millennium, since they were largely of his making. Without his tax, regulatory, and antitrust policies, there would have been no savings and loan bailout, no frenzy of mergers in the 1980s and 1990s, no unseemly scramble for overnight fortunes by arbitrageurs and raiders, no destructive obsession with quarterly earnings at the expense of long-term investment, no wholesale abandonment of ethics on the part of corporate executives, nor would have there been an Enron or a subprime mortgage crisis, which sent shockwaves through the global financial system and placed the country on the brink of its worst economic downturn since the Great Depression.